Okay, now it's time to start working on the rear suspension. We've got the corner we're working on supported on a jack stand. I personally don't like to raise both ends of the or both sides of the vehicle at the same time, or put all four corners on jack stands at the same time, because you're working with really heavy and very tight bolts. It takes some force, and sometimes you have to use pry bars and whatnot to get pieces to align and all that. And you don't want to take a chance of knocking the car off the jack stands. And if you just have it on one, the other three tires are still touching the ground to help it be more stable. So I recommend just putting a jack stand on the side you're working on. And now we just got to go back and take the tire off, and then we can get to work on the suspension. Once you get the tire off, on mine, I've got a MagnaFlow exhaust system. So I had to come in here and lower the tailpipe. All you do is remove two 13mm bolts that hold the two back rubber isolators, exhaust isolators on the body. And it's two little 13mm bolts back here. Isolators and all come down, and I just used a strap wrench to rotate the pipe out of the way. And that's to allow me access to that lower control arm bolt. The stock exhaust you might get by on the passenger side without having to move the exhaust at all, but you still will have to do it on the driver's side. Next thing I want to do is remove the two 16mm upper shot bolts. And then you want to remove the 18mm lower shot bolt right here. And there's a 15mm nut on the other side, so you need to use a crescent wrench or a boxing wrench to hold the bolt still while you back the nut off. Now the next thing we need to do is lower this assembly, which will then allow the shock to come out and the spring will just droop out. There's a couple of ways you can do this. I've got an older copy of a manual from a Charger, and it says to remove the springs and shocks to support the differential and remove the cross member bolts that hold that whole rear end together, and to lower it one side at a time. Or work on one side at a time only. It says if you do both sides that you'll have to get an alignment. That if you do one side at a time, it keeps the alignment in check. Since we're doing a lowering kit anyway, it's going to require an alignment. Dodge Boy 77 from Challenger Talk and I have been swapping some emails back and forth, and he said that the better way to do it was to remove the lower control arm bolt and just let that droop down, and the spring would come out that way. And then you don't have to worry about putting that cradle and all that back in. You just have to worry about lining that control arm back up to the bolt hole. So that's the route I'm going to take it. Looking at it, it looks like that's the easier thing to do. So what we're going to do is we're going to disconnect our brake line up there to give it some slack, and then we're going to start working on getting that lower control arm bolt out. And this brake line bracket is just a little 10mm coarse threaded body bolt. It doesn't take a whole lot to get it out. Now before you start removing that lower control arm bolt, keep in mind that spring is putting a lot of force on that control arm. So you want to come underneath it with a jack, and there's a pocket in the bottom of the control arm that my jack just happens to fit right into. So I put just a touch of tension on that control arm to keep it in place while I remove that bolt. And once the bolt is out, we'll just lower the jack down and let the control arm ease down, and I'll take the spring and shock out. Now the bolt on the back side is an 18mm right here, and there's or the nut I should say is 18mm. Behind the nut back here is the bolt, and the bolt head is 15mm. What you have to do, the bushing is threaded, so you just unscrew the bolt and let it ease its way out. Now you may have to adjust your jack a little bit to keep tension off of that bolt. You don't want to let it get bound up and start stripping the threads or anything like that, but get the tension off of it and then just back it out and then lower your jack down. Okay, we've got the lower control arm bolt out. Now we're just going to very easily lower the control arm. As you can see, it just takes the tension right off that spring and shock. It'll just fall right out almost. There's our spring isolator. There's our stock spring. There's our stock Needle mat shock. You can tell you have needle mats if you got that big bar at the end. When you're reinstalling your Eibach spring, you want to make sure the wording and lettering are facing up so that you can read them. That's the direction it needs to go. Your top isolator just snaps down on and make sure it's seated. And when you look in the bottom of the control arm, you'll see this. It's the bottom spring isolator. Notice that it has a nub in the back. There's a indentation in the lower control arm where that is to go. So when you're reinstalling that, make sure the bottom of your spring touches against that ledge and that that nub is in its slot in the control arm. Now for this next part, you might need some help. So what we have to do, we have to jack the lower control arm up so that the spring seats in that perch, all the while keeping it aligned so that we can get that lower control arm bolt back into place. So you may have to have somebody work the jack while